He despised her on their honeymoon. But what happened next changed everything. When jealousy awakened, he discovered a love he didn't even know. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't miss the moment his heart finally surrendered. The presidential suite at the Biltmore in Santa Barbara had the most spectacular Pacific Ocean views that Emma Harrison had witnessed in her 28 years of life. The infinite blue merged with the sky in a line that seemed drawn by the hand of a particularly inspired god, and the last lights of sunset painted the water with brushstrokes of gold and crimson. From the white marble balcony, she could see the Channel Islands silhouetted against the horizon, like whispered promises. But none of that beauty mattered. Emma sat on the edge of the king-size bed, her trembling hands gripping the Egyptian silk sheet so tightly that her knuckles had turned white as porcelain. Around her, red rose petals formed a heart on the immaculate comforter, and the sweet, cloying aroma of flowers mixed with the salty breeze entering through the open terrace. Scented candles burned in every corner, casting dancing shadows on the cream-colored walls. Everything had been prepared for a night of passion. Everything, except the man who should be by her side. The door to the adjoining room had closed exactly 37 minutes ago. Emma knew because she had counted every second, every painful beat of her heart, every labored breath she struggled to contain. Alexander Hayes, her husband for exactly 7 hours, had murmured something about reviewing urgent documents before disappearing behind that walnut door, leaving her alone on what should be the most important night of her life. Tears began to fall without permission, silent and hot, tracing bright paths down her cheeks. She wiped them with the back of her hand, but others immediately replaced them, as if her body had decided on its own that there was no reason to hold back anymore. 3 hours ago, Emma wore a Vera Wang wedding dress that cost more than the house where she'd grown up in the hills of Napa Valley. Belgian lace hugged her waist like an embrace, and the 15-foot train had swept the aisle of the small church in Yountville as she walked toward the altar on her father's arm. The guests had sighed at her beauty, and she had smiled with the hope of a child who still believes in fairy tales. Now she wore only an ivory silk nightgown, and the humiliation of a bride rejected on her first night as a married woman. She stood slowly, her legs trembling under the weight of a reality she refused to accept. She walked toward the full-length mirror occupying a corner of the room and observed herself with eyes she no longer recognized. The professional makeup applied that morning was smudged, creating dark shadows under her hazel eyes. Her hair, which had been carefully arranged in an elegant updo, now fell in disheveled strands over her shoulders. What had she expected exactly? The question burned inside her like the bourbon her grandfather used to drink after dinner. She had accepted this marriage with her eyes open, or so she believed. She knew it was a business arrangement, a transaction that would save her parents' winery from financial ruin. But somewhere secret in her heart, she had harbored the hope that Alexander would one day look at her as something more than a contractual obligation. That hope had just drowned in rose petals. The sound of her cell phone startled her. She found it on the nightstand, vibrating insistently. Her mother's name glowed on the screen. Mum. Emma hesitated. How could she tell Margaret Harrison that her daughter was alone on her wedding night, crying while her husband worked in the next room? How could she destroy the joy she'd seen in her parents' eyes when Alexander had agreed to invest the necessary funds to save Harrison Estate Winery? She couldn't. She wouldn't. She let the phone continue vibrating until silence returned, as thick and suffocating as before. She approached the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Below, on the hotel terrace, couples dined by candlelight, their laughter reaching her like echoes of a life that didn't belong to her. She saw a man lean over to kiss his wife's hand and felt something break definitively inside her chest. During the private flight from San Francisco that afternoon, Alexander had worked on his laptop without addressing a single word to her. She had tried to start a conversation about Santa Barbara, about the places they could visit, about the restaurant she'd researched for their first dinner as husband and wife. He had responded with monosyllables, his grey eyes fixed on the screen, his fingers typing with an urgency that suggested anything was more important than her. In the car from the airport, she had observed the coastal landscape unfold before her eyes. The hills dotted with cypress trees, the Spanish-style houses with purple bougainvillea, the impossibly blue sea. She had wanted to share her amazement, but Alexander had been on the phone the entire journey, discussing figures and percentages with someone named Robert. And now, in the most luxurious suite of the most exclusive hotel on the coast, Emma Harrison Hayes finally understood the truth she had tried to ignore during the 6 months of their official engagement. For Alexander, she was nothing more than another asset in his investment portfolio. A sob escaped her lips, louder than she intended. She covered her mouth with her hand, terrified that he might hear her through the wall. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want anything from him, she told herself, though she knew it was a lie. What Emma didn't know was that on the other side of that walnut door, Alexander Hayes was sitting on the edge of his own bed, his head in his hands and his heart beating with a violence that scared him. The laptop remained closed on the desk. The documents he'd mentioned didn't exist. He had fled because having her near was unbearable. He had fled because when he saw her walk toward him down the aisle of that church, something inside him had awakened with such force that he didn't know how to handle it. He had fled because Alexander Hayes, the man who had built a luxury hotel empire before turning 35, the man whose name appeared on lists of the most influential businessmen in America, didn't have the slightest idea how to love a woman. And that terrified him more than any financial crisis, more than any competitor, more than any threat to his business. Emma was real. Emma was vulnerable. Emma looked at him with eyes that asked for something he didn't know how to give. And so, instead of entering that rose-scented room and facing his own demons, Alexander had chosen the cowardice of silence. The night continued its course, as indifferent to human pain as the sea breaking against the rocks below the hotel. And when the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky with the same colors that had bid farewell the previous day, it found two people in separate rooms, both awake, both broken, both too proud to take the first step toward the other. Thus began the marriage of Emma and Alexander Hayes. Thus began the story that neither of them knew they were writing. 3 weeks after the honeymoon that never was, Emma found herself wandering the hallways of Hayes Manor, the mansion that was technically now her home. The property rose on a clifftop in the Hamptons, with panoramic ocean views that took the breath away from any visitor. But for Emma, those walls of glass and white concrete were nothing more than a gilded cage. The architecture was impeccable, the work of a famous Japanese studio that had combined minimalist lines with open spaces that flowed into each other like water. Italian travertine marble floors reflected the light streaming in through floor-to-ceiling windows. Contemporary artwork hung strategically on immaculate walls, a Rothko in the foyer, a Pollock in the main living room, a series of black and white photographs by Annie Leibovitz in the hallway leading to the library. Everything was perfect. Everything was cold. Everything seemed designed to impress, never to welcome. Emma ran her hand over the back of a designer sofa, the grey leather so soft it barely felt beneath her fingers. In Napa, the sofa in her parents' house was worn green velvet, with marks from old Cat Murphy's claws and red wine stains that could never be completely removed. That sofa told stories. This one said absolutely nothing. Her steps echoed against the marble as she walked toward the kitchen, so large it could house an entire team of chefs. And in fact it did. 3 professional cooks took turns preparing meals that Emma rarely shared with her husband. Alexander left the mansion at 6 in the morning, when the sky still showed the last vestiges of night. His black Bentley disappeared down the palm-lined driveway, while Emma watched from her bedroom window, coffee growing cold between her hands. He returned after midnight, when she had already given up waiting for him awake. Sometimes Emma heard his footsteps in the hallway, pausing briefly outside her door before continuing toward the master suite at the other end of the West Wing. They slept in separate rooms. It was a decision that neither had verbalized, but both had tacitly accepted since that first night in Santa Barbara. That October morning, Emma found Rosa Martinez in the kitchen, preparing scrambled eggs with the same care she would put into a work of art. Rosa was 63 years old, with eyes the color of ripe hazelnuts and hands that had cooked for 3 generations of the Hayes family. She was the only person in that house who treated Emma like a human being, and not just the new Mrs. Hayes. "Good morning, Mija," Rosa greeted her, her slight Mexican accent softening the words. "You look like you haven't slept well again." Emma sat on one of the Central Island's bar stools, watching Rosa expertly scramble the eggs. Sleep doesn't come easily in houses this big. Rosa looked at her over her shoulder, her eyes full of a compassion Emma hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. "Want to talk about it?" "What is there to say?" Emma played with the linen napkin. "My husband avoids me like I'm contagious. I live in a house where I don't know anyone, and every morning I ask myself what I'm doing here." Rosa served a plate of eggs in front of her, golden and perfect, accompanied by toast and a steaming cup of coffee. "Eat first. Problems weigh less on a full stomach." Emma obeyed, more out of courtesy than hunger. The eggs were delicious, creamy and perfectly seasoned in a way that reminded her of Sunday mornings in her grandmother's kitchen. "Can I ask you a question, Rosa?" "As many as you want, Mija. Has it always been like this? Alexander, I mean. Has he always been so closed off?" Rosa sighed, wiping her hands on her apron before sitting on the stool next to Emma. For a long moment, she seemed to debate with herself about how much to reveal. "I met Alexander when he was 5 years old," she finally began, her voice lowering as if she feared the walls might hear. "He was a different boy then, happy, curious. He loved to follow me around the kitchen while I cooked, asking questions about everything." Emma tried to imagine her husband as a happy child and failed spectacularly. What changed? His mother. The word fell between them like a stone in a still pond, creating ripples that expanded in the silence. "Catherine Hayes was a beautiful woman," Rosa continued. "Blonde, tall, with a smile that lit up any room. Alexander adored her. She was his whole world." "What happened to her?" Rosa looked away toward the window, where the mansion's garden extended in perfectly designed terraces to the cliff's edge. "She left. One night she just left. She left a note saying she couldn't continue living that life, that she'd found someone who made her feel truly alive, and she disappeared." Emma felt the air thicken around her. She abandoned her son and her husband. Mr. Thomas never recovered. He spent the next years drinking and working in that order. He died of a heart attack at 52, alone in his office at 3 in the morning. My God! Alexander was 16 when his father died. By then, he'd already become the man you know now. Closed off, controlled, incapable of showing weakness. Emma pushed the plate of eggs away. Her appetite completely vanished. "Why are you telling me this, Rosa?" The older woman took her hand between hers, the skin rough and warm like fresh bread. "Because I see how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. There's something there, Mija, something fighting to get out. But he's so scared." "Scared of what?" "Of feeling, of needing, of losing someone who matters to him again." Emma gently withdrew her hand, a confusing mixture of emotions churning in her chest. "Understanding the origin of his coldness doesn't make it easier to bear, Rosa." "No, but maybe it will help you be patient." "Why should I be patient with someone who treats me like furniture?" Rosa stood collecting the barely touched plate with an expression that mixed sadness and hope. "Because you, Emma, are exactly what Alexander needs, and I believe that, deep in that armored heart, he knows it." That afternoon, Emma explored the mansion's library, a double-height space with walnut shelves reaching to the vaulted ceiling. She had found her refuge among those book-lined walls, in the leather armchairs by the stone fireplace, in the silence that smelled of old paper and unexplored possibilities. She was reading a novel by Toni Morrison when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Alexander appeared in the doorway, and she looked up with a mixture of surprise and caution. It was 4 in the afternoon. He was never home at this hour. "Emma," he said, his voice as formal as if addressing a business partner. "Alexander." He entered the library, his eyes scanning the room as if seeing it for the first time. "I didn't know you spent time here. There are many things you don't know about me." The comment floated between them, loaded with a reproach Emma didn't bother to hide. Alexander tensed his jaw but didn't respond. Instead, he approached one of the bookshelves and ran his fingers along the spines of books. "My father spent hours in this room," he said finally, his voice so low Emma had to lean in to hear. He read until 3 in the morning, every night. It was the first piece of personal information he'd shared with her since they met. Emma closed the book on her lap, holding her breath. What did he read? Everything, but mostly philosophy. Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoics. Alexander let out a bitter laugh. He spent his life reading about how to control emotions, but he could never overcome my mother's abandonment. Emma didn't know what to say. The silence extended between them, but it was a different silence this time. Less hostile, more fragile. I have a business dinner Friday, Alexander continued, returning to his neutral tone. A charity gala at the Met in New York. My assistant will send you the details. You want me to accompany you? You're my wife. It's your duty to accompany me to public events. The word duty hit Emma like a slap. She felt the brief moment of connection evaporate as quickly as it had arrived. Of course, she responded, her voice turning to ice. Duty, how could I forget? Alexander looked at her for a long moment, something indefinable shining in his grey eyes. But whatever it was, he crushed it before Emma could identify it. My assistant will coordinate your wardrobe with the stylist. And without another word, he left the library as abruptly as he'd arrived. Emma remained motionless in her armchair, the book forgotten on her lap, staring at the empty space where he had been. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the Atlantic, painting the sky with the colors of fire, and somewhere deep in her chest, a spark of something that dangerously resembled hope refused to be extinguished. The dress that Alexander's stylist had selected was midnight blue that highlighted the olive tone of Emma's skin. Carolina Herrera, mermaid cut, with a discreet but elegant neckline that revealed the curve of her collarbones. The diamond earrings that had arrived in a black velvet box that same afternoon sparkled like captured stars beside her cheeks. Emma looked at herself in the dressing room mirror, barely recognizing the woman who looked back at her. For 28 years, she'd been the daughter of winemakers, the girl who ran barefoot between rows of vines and helped her father bottle the season's wine. Now she was Mrs. Alexander Hayes, a doll dressed in silk and diamonds to play her role on her husband's social stage. The car arrived at 7 o'clock sharp. Emma descended the marble stairs carefully, her 4-inch heels threatening her balance on each step. Alexander waited for her in the foyer, impeccable in a black tuxedo that seemed to have been sewn directly onto his body. When she appeared at the top of the stairs, he looked up from his phone. And for a fraction of a second, so brief Emma almost believed she'd imagined it, something changed in his expression. His eyes widened slightly, his lips parted in what could have been the beginning of a word never spoken. But then the moment passed, and the mask of indifference returned to its place. "The car is waiting," he said simply. The journey to New York was silent, like all the others. Alexander worked on his tablet while the Bentley devoured miles of highway. Emma looked out the window, watching the lights of towns pass like terrestrial constellations in the darkness. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed for the occasion. The building's facade glowed under strategically placed spotlights, and a red carpet extended from the sidewalk to the main doors. Photographers flanked the entrance, their flashes bursting like lightning every time a celebrity emerged from a luxury car. "Smile," Alexander murmured as he offered his hand to help her out of the vehicle. "It's an order, not a request." Emma smiled, but her eyes remained cold as they posed for photographers. The cameras captured what appeared to be a perfect couple. He, tall and distinguished with his black hair combed back. She, elegant and serene at his side. No one could see the cracks beneath the polished surface. The museum's interior had been transformed into a dreamlike ballroom. Round tables with white linen tablecloths were distributed among the artworks, each illuminated by crystal chandeliers that cast golden light over the diners. A chamber orchestra played softly from a corner, and waiters with white gloves circulated, offering Dom Perignon in crystal flutes. Emma recognized several faces from society magazines: a silver-haired duchess conversing with a famous tenor, a telecommunications mogul laughing with the Secretary of Culture, an Oscar-winning actress posing next to a Degas painting. Alexander guided her through the crowd with his hand lightly resting on her lower back, the only physical contact between them since the wedding. It was a gesture more possessive than affectionate, Emma noted, as if he were marking territory. "Alexander, darling," a female voice intercepted them. "How wonderful to see you." The woman who approached was tall, platinum blonde, wearing a red dress that left little to the imagination. Her crimson lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes when she looked at Emma. "Monica," Alexander responded, and Emma caught a subtle tension in his voice. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Emma." "Ah, yes, the winery girl." Monica looked her up and down with a gaze that clearly found the result insufficient. "I've heard so much about you." "I can't say the same," Emma replied, her tone perfectly polite, "but it's a pleasure to meet you." Monica blinked. Clearly unaccustomed to having her barbs returned, Alexander suppressed what might have been a smile. "If you'll excuse us," he said, steering Emma toward another part of the ballroom. "Who was that?" Emma asked when they were at a safe distance. "No one important. She seemed to know you quite well." Alexander glanced at her sideways. "Is that jealousy?" "That's curiosity. There's a difference." He didn't respond, but something flashed in his eyes that Emma couldn't interpret. The dinner proceeded in a sea of trivial conversations and false smiles. Emma sat next to a businessman from Miami who insisted on talking to her about his yacht collection, while Alexander discussed figures with a German investor on the other side of the table. Every few minutes, their gazes crossed, and she swore she saw something deeper beneath the surface of courtesy. It was during dessert when everything changed. Emma had excused herself to go to the restroom, needing a moment of solitude away from that suffocating crowd. She was touching up her lipstick in front of the mirror when the door opened, and Monica entered, her heels clicking against the marble like war drums. "So you're the lucky one who caught Alexander," she said, positioning herself next to Emma in front of the mirror. "I must admit, I'm impressed." "Why?" "Because Alexander never interested himself in anyone, and suddenly he marries an unknown from wine country." Monica took out lipstick from her purse and began applying it with surgical precision. "There must be something special about you that I'm not seeing." Emma turned to face her directly. "Or perhaps you're just not as perceptive as you think." Monica let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Oh, I like you. You have fire." She moved closer, lowering her voice. "But let me give you some advice, dear. I've known Alexander for 10 years. We slept together for 3 of them. And if there's one thing I know for certain, it's that that man is incapable of love." The words hit Emma like a wave of ice water, but she refused to show their impact. "Thanks for the advice," she responded, putting her lipstick in her clutch, "but I don't need it." And she left the restroom with her head held high, though inside she felt everything crumbling. The rest of the evening was torture. Every time Emma looked at Alexander, she saw Monica's hands on his skin, her red lips leaving marks in places she hadn't even touched. The champagne she'd drunk turned acidic in her stomach, and the smiles she offered guests became increasingly forced. In the car back, the silence weighed like lead. "Monica said something to you," Alexander stated. It wasn't a question. Emma didn't respond, keeping her gaze fixed on the road unfolding before them in the darkness. "Whatever she told you." "It doesn't matter," she interrupted him. "Whatever you and she had is none of my business. After all, this marriage isn't real, is it? It's just a business arrangement." Alexander clenched his jaw but said nothing. "The only thing I need to know," Emma continued, her voice trembling despite her efforts to control it, "is if you still see her." "No." "Why should I believe you?" Alexander sharply turned the wheel, stopping the car on the highway shoulder. The engine purred in the stillness as he turned to face her. "Because I've never lied to you, Emma. I've failed you in many ways, I know, but I've never lied to you." His eyes shone in the car's dimness, and for the first time since she'd known him, Emma saw something that seemed genuine behind that iron mask. "Monica was a mistake from my past," he continued. "A physical distraction, nothing more. What we have, you and I. It may not be what you imagined, but it's more real than anything I ever had with her." "Why? Because we signed a contract?" "Because you're my wife." The words came out with an intensity that surprised her. "And even though I haven't known how to show you, that means something to me." Emma felt tears threatening to spill, but she held them back by sheer force of will. "Words are easy." "Alexander," It's actions that matter. He nodded slowly, as if he'd just heard a truth he'd been avoiding. You're right. And without saying anything more, he restarted the engine and resumed the journey to the Hamptons. That night, as Emma prepared for bed in her solitary room, she heard a soft knock on the door. When she opened it, she found Alexander standing in the hallway. Without his tuxedo jacket, his tie loosened and an expression she'd never seen before. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to be what you need, but I want to try." And without waiting for an answer, he placed a kiss on her forehead, soft, almost shy, before turning and disappearing down the hallway. Emma closed the door and leaned against it, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her temples. For the first time since Santa Barbara, she allowed herself to believe that maybe there was something worth saving. The following weeks brought changes so subtle that a casual observer wouldn't have noticed them. But Emma, who had learned to read every micro-expression on her husband's face as if it were an ancient text, perceived them all. Alexander began having breakfast with her. Not every day, but at least 3 times a week he came down to the dining room before 7, when the Atlantic sunrise light entered obliquely through the windows and illuminated his face in ways that softened it. The conversations were brief, focused on safe topics like the weather or the day's news, but they were conversations. And for Emma, hungry for any crumb of connection, they were a feast. One November morning, Rosa served scrambled eggs that made Alexander close his eyes in evident pleasure. "These are exactly like my grandmother used to make," he commented, and there was something of a child in his expression that made Emma feel a pang of tenderness. "Your grandmother taught me," Rosa responded from the kitchen. "I spent many afternoons in her kitchen when I was young, before arthritis prevented her from holding a pan." Alexander said nothing more, but Emma noticed how his fingers tightened around his fork and how his gaze briefly lost itself in some distant memory. "Tell me about her," Emma asked softly. "About your grandmother." He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I want to know you, the real person, not just the businessman." The silence extended between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that precedes revelations, loaded with possibilities. "Her name was Eleanor," Alexander finally said. "She was widowed at 40, but she never let that define her. She had a vineyard in Sonoma, inherited from her father, and she managed it with an iron fist and a heart of gold." "A vineyard?" Emma's eyes lit up. "Is that why? Why I agreed to invest in your parents?" He sketched something that could almost be called a smile. "Partially. Grandma Eleanor died when I was 12. We sold the vineyard because my father had no interest in continuing it. I always regretted that." Emma processed this information, adding it to the fragmentary mosaic she was building of her husband. "Maybe someday you could visit my parents," she offered. "It's not as big as your grandmother's must have been, but there's something special about walking among the vines at sunset, when the leaves shine like they're made of gold." Alexander looked at her with an indecipherable expression. Maybe someday. That night, while Emma read in the library, he appeared in the doorway without warning. He brought a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "It's a Napa Cabernet from 2015, he explained, showing her the label. "I was told it's exceptional." She accepted the glass he offered, their fingers briefly brushing in the transfer. "What's the occasion?" "There's no occasion." Alexander sat in the armchair facing her, something he'd never done before. "I just thought we could talk." The wine was extraordinary, with notes of ripe cherry and spices that danced on the tongue. But Emma barely noticed, too conscious of the novelty of that moment. They talked for hours that night. Alexander told her about his first business at 23, a small boutique hotel in Boston that he'd bought with his father's inheritance and transformed into the first of what would become an empire. She told him about her childhood in Napa, about the family harvests that brought 3 generations together under the same sky, about the first time she crushed grapes with her bare feet at 6 years old and swore she'd never felt anything so magical. "It sounds like a happy life," he observed, and there was something of envy in his voice. "It was. It is. My parents don't have much money, but there was always more than enough love. Love in abundance is a luxury not all of us know." Emma set her glass on the side table and leaned forward. You can know it, Alexander. It's never too late. He looked at her fixedly for a moment that seemed to stretch to infinity. Then, as if he'd made a decision, he got up from his armchair and walked toward her. He knelt in front of her seat, taking her hands between his. I don't know what I did to deserve you, he said, and his voice was rough as sandpaper. But I'm beginning to believe that maybe fate knows something I don't. Emma felt her heart rise to her throat. Alexander, don't say anything. He squeezed her hands gently. Just let me try. Let me learn to be the husband you should have had from the beginning. And when he leaned in to kiss her, not on the forehead this time, but on the lips, soft and tentative like a question, Emma knew that something fundamental had changed between them. The kiss lasted barely a few seconds, but it left a mark as deep as if it had lasted a lifetime. When Alexander pulled back, his eyes sought hers with a vulnerability that left her breathless. Is this okay? He asked. Is this okay? Emma responded by pulling him toward her for another kiss. This one deeper, more honest, loaded with all the words neither of them knew how to pronounce yet. That night, for the first time since they'd married, they slept in the same bed. There was nothing more than that. Sleeping, with hands intertwined on the silk sheets like castaways, clinging to a lifebuoy in the middle of the ocean. But it was a beginning. And beginnings, as Emma had learned in her father's vineyards, are where the best harvests are born. Winter arrived in the Hamptons, with unusual rains that beat against Hayes Manor's windows like impatient fingers. Emma had learned to love the sound of water against glass, the smell of wet earth rising from the gardens, the way grey light softened the mansion's hard angles. Her relationship with Alexander had blossomed like orange trees in spring. Breakfast together had become sacred rituals, dinners into conversations that sometimes extended until dawn, nights into territories of mutual exploration where each caress was a discovery and each kiss a promise. But the most dangerous storms are the ones we don't see coming. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, in a cream paper envelope with the Hayes family crest embossed in gold. Catherine Hayes, Alexander's mother, requested the presence of her son and his wife for the traditional Christmas lunch at the family estate in Connecticut. Emma watched Alexander's face transform as he read the note, as if a steel curtain descended over his features. "We're not going," he declared, leaving the invitation on the table as if it burned. "Why not? My mother and I don't have the best relationship." "That's not a reason. It's an excuse." Alexander looked at her with something that dangerously resembled a warning. "Trust me when I say you don't want to meet Catherine Hayes. She's your mother, Alexander, and my mother-in-law. Sooner or later, I'll have to meet her." "Make it later, then." Emma frowned, sensing there was something more he wasn't telling her. "What happened between you two?" The silence that followed was dense as the fog that sometimes covered the ocean in the mornings. "She was the one who orchestrated this marriage," Alexander finally said, each word weighing like lead. "Without my knowledge or consent." "What?" "I didn't know anything about the arrangement with your parents until it was done. My mother took care of everything, the negotiations, the contract, the conditions. When she presented it to me, it was too late to back out without destroying both families' reputations." Emma felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "So you didn't? You didn't want to marry me?" "I didn't want to marry anyone." Alexander ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd learned to recognize. "But when I saw you for the first time, at that engagement party my mother organized without consulting me, I thought maybe it wouldn't be so terrible. How romantic." The irony in her voice was sharp as glass. "I'm not saying it well." He approached her, taking her hands. "What I'm trying to say is that my mother manipulated me and you, and that's something I can't forgive her for." Emma processed the information slowly, feeling how pieces of the puzzle fit into places she hadn't anticipated. "But now, do you regret marrying me?" Alexander looked at her with an intensity that left her breathless. "No. God, no. Marrying you is the only good thing that's come from all this manipulation, but that doesn't mean I want to expose what we have to my mother. She destroys everything she touches." "Or maybe," Emma said softly, "it's time to face the past so we can build a future." He shook his head, but she saw the doubt in his eyes. "Think about it," she insisted. "We can go together. Face it together." The decision hung suspended between them like an unanswered question. 2 days later, Alexander entered the library where Emma was reading and deposited a kiss in her hair. "I've accepted my mother's invitation," he announced, "but let it be known that I think it's a terrible idea." Emma smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. The best stories begin with terrible ideas. She didn't know how prophetic those words would prove to be. The Hayes estate in Connecticut was an old colonial mansion restored with exquisite taste, surrounded by oak and maple trees. The white clapboard walls gleamed under the December sun, and the scent of pine floated in the air despite the winter cold. Catherine received them in the main parlor under a chandelier of Waterford crystal. She was younger than Emma had imagined, with silver hair arranged in an elegant chignon and eyes of the same steely grey as her son. She wore a cashmere ensemble in bone colour that probably cost more than Emma's parents' car. "Alexander, darling." She kissed her son on both cheeks with practiced efficiency. "How long it's been since I've seen you." "Mother." The coldness in his voice was palpable. Catherine seemed not to notice, turning her attention to Emma with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And you must be Emma. I've heard so much about you. I hope good things. Interesting things." Catherine linked her arm with Emma's, guiding her toward the interior of the house. "Come, dear. We have much to discuss." Alexander made a move to follow them, but his mother stopped him with a look. "Robert wants to see you in the study. Something about next quarter's projections." "It can wait." "It can't, dear. You know how these investors are." Catherine directed another of her empty smiles at Emma. "Don't worry, it'll just be a little chat between women." Before Emma could protest, she found herself in a room decorated with Connecticut antiques, alone with her mother-in-law, and no idea of what was about to happen. Catherine served tea from an antique silver teapot, her movements precise as a professional dancer's. "I suppose my son has told you his version of how you came to be married," she began, offering her a porcelain cup. "He told me it was you who organized everything." "That's correct." There was no shame in her voice, only pragmatism. Alexander needed a wife. His investors were concerned about his lifestyle, let's say erratic, and your family needed financial salvation. It was an arrangement that benefited everyone. Except no one asked me if I wanted to be part of it. Catherine let out a dry laugh. "Dear, you were given exactly what you wanted. A rich husband, a life of luxury, security for your parents. What more could a girl from wine country ask for?" Emma felt blood rush to her face. Love, perhaps. Love. Catherine pronounced the word as if it were a contagious disease. "Love destroyed my husband when his first wife abandoned him. Love almost destroyed my son when he saw the result. Love is a luxury the Hayes cannot afford. With all due respect, Ma'am, I think you're wrong." Catherine's eyes hardened. "You're more stubborn than I anticipated. That could be a problem." "A problem for whom?" "For everyone." Catherine set her cup on the table with a sharp clink. "Listen to me well, Emma. You can play the loving wife all you want, but don't fool yourself. Alexander is incapable of love. I've watched him try and fail for 35 years. And when you finally realize that, because you will, dear, everyone does, you'll become another of his disappointments." Emma stood up, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "You don't know your son. Maybe you knew him once, but not anymore. The man who sleeps beside me every night is capable of more love than you'll ever know." Catherine looked at her with something that could have been respect, or could have been pity. "Time will tell who's right, dear. Time always tells the truth." When Alexander found Emma in the garden an hour later, with reddened eyes and arms crossed over her chest like a shield, he knew something terrible had happened. "What did she say to you?" he asked, fury barely contained in his voice. "Nothing I didn't already know." "Emma, let's leave." She looked at him directly in the eyes. "I don't want to spend another minute in this house." Alexander didn't argue. He took her hand and guided her to the car, without even saying goodbye to his mother, who watched them from a first-floor window with an expression that could have been satisfaction or could have been sadness. In the car, on the way back to the Hamptons, Emma broke the silence. Your mother believes you're incapable of love. Alexander gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. My mother believes many wrong things. Is she wrong about this? He stopped the car at a lookout with views of the Connecticut hills, where the setting sun painted the sky orange and pink. For a long time I thought she was right, he admitted, looking toward the horizon. I thought something was broken in me, that I was defective in some fundamental way. And now? Alexander turned toward her, taking her face between his hands with a delicacy that made her hold her breath. Now I know she was wrong, because I love you, Emma. I love you in a way that terrifies me, that defies everything I thought I knew about myself. But it's real as the stars that are beginning to come out up there. Tears ran down Emma's cheeks, but this time they were from relief. I love you too, she whispered, though it took me a while to realize it. The kiss they shared under that starry sky was different from all the previous ones. It was a declaration, an oath, the beginning of something both had feared and desired in equal measure. But the shadows of the past, as Emma would soon learn, have a way of pursuing us when we least expect it. Spring arrived in the Hamptons with explosions of purple wisteria and the intoxicating perfume of night-blooming jasmine. Emma had begun to feel genuinely happy, a sensation that seemed so strange after months of uncertainty that it sometimes scared her. Her life had found a rhythm. Breakfasts with Alexander, mornings in the library or walking through the mansion's gardens, afternoons working on the new project she'd initiated, a support program for small family wineries in danger of bankruptcy, nights alternating between quiet dinners and social events where she no longer felt like a stranger. Alexander had changed in ways that still surprised her. He'd reduced his work hours, delegating more to his management team. Laughter, which before was as rare as a solar eclipse, now appeared frequently, especially when she told stories of her childhood in Napa. And in bed, he'd learned to be tender as well as passionate, to stay holding her afterward instead of retreating to his side of the bed as he used to. It was at one of those galas that her life would change once again. The event was the opening of a new haute cuisine restaurant in Manhattan, owned by a California entrepreneur who had revolutionized the American gastronomy scene. Emma wore an emerald green evening gown that brought out the honey tone of her eyes, and for the first time since she'd started attending these events, she felt truly comfortable. Alexander had been called away for a conversation with some investors, leaving her alone next to an artistic installation of bubbling champagne. That's when he appeared. Emma Harrison? The voice made her turn. The man before her was tall, with wavy brown hair falling over a tanned forehead and eyes of an intense green that shone with recognition. Daniel, she whispered, feeling how the past hit her like an unexpected wave. Daniel Cooper. He smiled, that warm smile she remembered from summers in college when they both studied viticulture at UC Davis and spent afternoons debating the tasting notes of different Cabernets. I can't believe it. Daniel hugged her with the familiarity of someone who shared laughter and dreams long ago. How many years has it been? 8? 9? 9, Emma confirmed, feeling a confusing mixture of emotions. Since that graduation party. The night I kissed you and you ran away, he laughed. I still wonder what would have happened if you hadn't fled. Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks. I was young, scared. And now you're Mrs. Alexander Hayes, I've heard. His tone was light, but something in his eyes suggested a deeper emotion. The world is small, very small. Emma looked around, instinctively searching for Alexander. What are you doing here? I'm the owner. Daniel extended his arms, encompassing the restaurant. Cooper Culinary, 15 restaurants across America and counting. Wow, you made it. We made it, you could say. Remember those afternoons in my student apartment, drawing plans for a restaurant that would serve only dishes made with Napa wines? Well, here we are. The conversation flowed naturally, as if the 9 intervening years had been just a blink. They talked about wines and travels, about fulfilled dreams and roads not taken. Daniel made her laugh with anecdotes about culinary disasters in his early years as a restaurateur, and she found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone else. She didn't realize that Alexander was watching them from across the room, his expression darkening with each laugh Emma shared with that stranger. "You should bring your husband to dinner at the Barcelona restaurant," Daniel was saying when Alexander materialized beside them. Emma, his voice was controlled, but she'd learned to recognize the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Who's your friend?" "Alexander, meet Daniel Cooper. We were classmates at UC Davis. Daniel, this is Alexander, my husband." The two men shook hands, and Emma could feel the tension crackling between them like static electricity. "Cooper Culinary," Alexander said. "I know the name. Impressive work." "Thanks. I've heard equally impressive things about your hotel empire." "I suppose rumors travel fast in these circles." Daniel smiled, but there was something sharp in his expression, especially rumors about unexpected marriages. The air thickened until it became almost unbearable. Emma intervened before the situation escalated. "Daniel was telling me about his new restaurant concept," she said, linking her arm with Alexander's. "It sounds fascinating." "Fascinating," Alexander repeated, his tone suggesting exactly the opposite. The evening continued, but something had changed irrevocably. Alexander barely let her go the rest of the night, his hand always on her back, his body always positioned between her and anyone else. And when Daniel approached to say goodbye, handing her a card with his personal number, "In case you ever want to discuss Napa wines," the look Alexander gave him could have frozen the Atlantic. In the car back, the silence was a third passenger, occupying all available space. "He was a friend from college," Emma finally said, unable to bear the tension any longer. "Nothing more." "Nothing more?" Alexander's voice was dangerously quiet. "He looked at you like a starving man looks at a feast. That's not fair." "It may not be fair, but it's true." Emma turned toward him, frustration boiling in her chest. "What do you want me to do, Alexander? Ignore any man who approaches me? Pretend my life started when we got married? I want you to recognize that that man has intentions that go beyond friendship. Even if that were true, what does it matter? I'm married to you. I love you." The declaration hung suspended in the air between them, but Alexander didn't respond. His hands gripped the steering wheel with a force that made the tendons stand out under the skin, and his jaw was so tense Emma feared it might break. That night, they slept on opposite sides of the bed without touching, and Emma couldn't help but wonder if the monster of jealousy that had just awakened would be their salvation or their destruction. The following weeks were an emotional roller coaster that left Emma exhausted and confused. Daniel had started sending flowers, not ostentatious roses, but delicate bouquets of white jasmine that appeared at the mansion's door every Friday without a card, but with a scent she immediately recognized. It was the same perfume her grandmother used to wear, and Daniel knew it because she'd told him 9 years ago. Alexander said nothing when he saw them, but his silence was more eloquent than any words. His eyes hardened, his jaw tensed, and he disappeared into his office for hours, leaving her alone with those flowers that were beginning to feel like a curse. "You should talk to him," Rosa advised her one morning as they prepared a paella together that neither had the appetite to eat. "Silence only feeds the demons he already has inside." "And what do I say? That the flowers mean nothing?" "He won't believe me." "Do they mean nothing?" Rosa looked at her with those eyes that seemed to see too much. "Or do they mean something you're afraid to admit?" Emma left the wooden spoon on the marble. "What are you insinuating?" "I'm not insinuating anything, Mija. I'm just asking. That man awakens something in you that your husband should see. Not desire, perhaps, but a memory of who you were before all this." The words hit closer to the target than Emma would have wanted to admit. Daniel represented a version of herself she'd almost forgotten, the passionate student who dreamed of changing the wine world, who debated for hours about tannins and fermentations, who believed the future was full of infinite possibilities. When had she stopped being that person? That afternoon, Emma made a decision she knew was risky. She called Daniel. "I need you to stop sending the flowers," she said without preamble when he answered. "Emma." His voice sounded warm, too intimate. "You finally decided to call me. Not for what you think. My marriage is important to me, Daniel, and those flowers are complicating everything." "The flowers? Or me?" Both. She sighed, running her hand through her hair. What we had, or what we could have had, was a long time ago. Now I'm with Alexander. Are you in love with him? The question took her by surprise. Yes. Then why do you sound so sad? She didn't know what to answer, because the truth was more complicated than she could put into words. She loved Alexander. Of that she was certain. But loving him was exhausting sometimes, like trying to embrace an iceberg that alternated between melting in her arms and freezing again when she least expected it. Look, Daniel continued, I don't pretend to ruin your marriage, but if you ever need to talk as friends, I'll be here. No flowers, no second intentions, just like the guy who used to steal your viticulture notes. Emma found herself smiling despite everything. Thanks, Daniel. She hung up the phone just as she heard footsteps behind her. Alexander was in the living room doorway, his face an indecipherable mask. Who was that? Daniel. I asked him to stop sending the flowers. And he agreed? Yes. Alexander crossed the living room until he stood in front of her, so close she could feel the heat from his body. Why did you call him instead of just ignoring him? Because he deserved a clear answer, and because you deserve to know I'm actively rejecting him, not just passively. Something softened in Alexander's expression. You're rejecting him? Of course I'm rejecting him. Emma took his face between her hands, forcing him to look at her directly. I love you, Alexander. With all the complications, with all the fears, with all the walls you still have up, I love you. He closed his eyes as if the words were too much to process. I don't understand it, he whispered. Why? What have I done to deserve it? Love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing, and I choose you. Every day, even when you make it difficult. When he kissed her, it was with a desperation that scared and excited her in equal measure. His hands held her as if he feared she'd disappear if he let go, and his mouth moved against hers as if he wanted to merge into her being. I need you, he said against her lips. I don't know how to tell you any other way. Then show me. What followed was different from all the previous times. There was urgency, yes, but there was also something deeper, something that resembled surrender. Alexander made love to her as if he were offering her all the parts of himself he'd kept hidden, and when they finally collapsed together in the tangled sheets, Emma felt they'd crossed a threshold from which there was no return. I'm scared, he confessed in the darkness, his voice barely a whisper against her hair. I'm scared of how much you mean to me. Fear doesn't go away, she responded, caressing the tense muscles of his back, but it doesn't have to control us. I don't know if I can promise you that. I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking you to keep trying. The silence that followed was different from all those they'd shared before. It was full of possibility. But storms don't end just because we decide they should, and the storm hanging over them was just beginning. The restaurant in Boston gleamed under the lights of hundreds of candles when Emma entered on Alexander's arm. It was the grand opening of Cooper Culinary Boston, and although everything in her being had told her she shouldn't be there, she'd accepted the invitation for reasons even she didn't fully understand. Maybe she needed to prove that Daniel wasn't a threat. Maybe she needed Alexander to see he could trust her, even in enemy territory. Or maybe, somewhere dark in her heart, she needed to see Daniel one last time to definitively close that chapter. The place was spectacular. An old harbor warehouse transformed into a temple of modern gastronomy. 100-year-old wooden beams supported a glass ceiling that revealed the stars, and long, rustic oak tables contrasted with contemporary designer tableware. Daniel received them personally, impeccable in a navy blue suit that brought out his green eyes. Emma, Alexander. His smile was warm but contained. Thank you for coming. Alexander shook his hand with a force bordering on hostility. Your assistant was very insistent. I know. I can be persuasive when I set my mind to it. Daniel's eyes briefly rested on Emma, and she felt Alexander tense beside her. The dinner was a culinary masterpiece. Each dish told a story. The Atlantic in a scallop carpaccio, the forests of Maine in a wild mushroom risotto, the passion of California in a chocolate dessert with olive oil and sea salt. But Emma barely tasted a bite, too aware of the undercurrents flowing between the three of them. Daniel visited them several times throughout the night. always with professional excuses, but his glances toward Emma lasted a second longer than appropriate. And each time, Alexander drank another sip of wine, his expression gradually darkening. "We should leave," Emma whispered after dessert. "No." Alexander's voice was stony. "Stay if you want. I need some air." Before she could protest, he'd gotten up and disappeared toward the terrace. Emma followed him immediately, but when she arrived outside, she found him leaning against the railing, looking at Boston Harbor, as if the anchored yachts had the answers he was searching for. "Alexander, do you love him?" The question came out raw, without preamble. "Did you love him before?" "No." "Then why do I feel like I'm losing you every time he's near?" Emma positioned herself beside him, the cold February air biting her bare skin. "Because you're scared, and fear distorts everything you touch. This isn't fear, Emma. It's instinct. I can see how he looks at you. I can see how you light up when you talk to him." "I light up because he reminds me of a version of myself I'd forgotten, not because I want to be with him." Alexander let out a bitter laugh. "And what's the difference? The difference is that that person I was before didn't have you, didn't have this, didn't have a future I could imagine clearly. And now I have you, and that's enough, more than enough." For an eternal moment, Alexander looked at her in silence. Then something broke in his expression. "I'm not enough," he said, and his voice was that of a defeated man. "I never will be. My mother was right. Don't say that. It's the truth. I'm cold, distant, incapable of giving you what you need, and sooner or later you'll realize you deserve something better. Alexander, listen to me. No." He pulled away from her, his face a mask of contained pain. "I've made a decision. I'm going to give you what you need." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm going to let you go, before you destroy me like my mother destroyed my father." And without saying anything more, he disappeared into the night, leaving her alone on that terrace with a broken heart and the certainty that everything they'd built had just crumbled. The following days were the darkest Emma had known. Alexander had left, not from the mansion, but from her life. He'd returned to sleeping in the master bedroom, to leaving at 6 in the morning and returning after midnight. They didn't talk. They didn't look at each other. It was as if the months of progress had been a dream from which both had awakened abruptly. Emma spent hours wandering through the library, unable to concentrate on anything. The books that once offered comfort now seemed to mock her with their promises of happy endings and loves that overcame all tests. Real life, she'd discovered, was much more complicated. Rosa found her crying over a cup of cold tea one rainy afternoon. "So this is what's happened," the older woman said, sitting beside her. "He went back to being the scared boy, and you're paying the price." "I told him everything right," Emma sobbed. "I told him I loved him. I told him I chose him. What more could I have done?" "Sometimes words aren't enough for someone who's learned not to trust them." "Then what do I do?" Rosa took her hands between hers. "There's one person who knows Alexander better than anyone. Someone who knows exactly what buttons to press to make him listen." "Who?" "His mother." Emma shuddered. "Catherine hates me. Catherine hates love because it reminds her of what she lost. But she loves her son in her twisted way. And you're the only person who's made him happy in 30 years. The idea was terrifying, but Emma was desperate. That same night, she dialed the number she'd sworn never to use again. "Mrs. Hayes, it's Emma. I need your help." The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds. "That," Catherine finally said, "is the last thing I expected to hear from you." 2 days later, Emma was sitting in the same Connecticut parlor where Catherine had tried to destroy her marriage months ago. The matriarch observed her, with eyes that seemed to register every micro-expression, every tremor of her hands. "So my son has returned to his old habits," Catherine said after Emma finished telling her everything. "I can't say I'm surprised. I need you to talk to him, to make him understand." "Make him understand what?" Catherine leaned forward. "That love isn't a threat. I've spent 30 years trying to convince myself of that without success." "But you love him, Alexander." Despite everything. Something flashed in the older woman's eyes, something that could have been pain or could have been recognition. A mother's love is different. It doesn't demand vulnerability. It doesn't demand exposure. All love demands vulnerability, Mom, even a mother's. Catherine studied her for a long moment. You're smarter than I thought, she finally admitted. And more tenacious. I'm just fighting for what I want. And what do you want exactly? I want Alexander to be happy, with or without me, but he needs to face his demons to be either of those things. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming on the velvet armrest. There's something I never told Alexander, she said slowly. Something I perhaps should have told him years ago. Emma held her breath. His father didn't die alone in that office. I was with him until the end. We'd spent the night talking, finally, after years of silence. He told me the only thing he regretted was not teaching our son that love was worth the risk, that he'd lost too much time protecting him from what he should have encouraged him to seek. Tears ran down Emma's cheeks. Why haven't you told him? Because I was afraid it was too late, that my own example had irreparably damaged his capacity to love. It's never too late. Catherine looked at her with something that dangerously resembled respect. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time for the Hayes to learn to take risks. That same night, Catherine called her son. Emma didn't know exactly what they said to each other, but when Alexander came looking for her 2 days later, with reddened eyes and trembling hands, she knew something fundamental had changed. My mother told me, was all he said before collapsing in her arms. About my father. About everything. And as she held him against her chest, feeling his tears soak the fabric of her dress, Emma understood that this was the real battle. Not against jealousy, not against Daniel, not against Catherine, but against decades of accumulated fear that were finally being released. Healing had begun. Therapy began a week later. Alexander had initially resisted the idea of talking to a stranger about his feelings, but when Emma told him it wasn't a request, but a condition for continuing the marriage, he yielded with a resignation that surprised her. The psychologist, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen with grey hair and eyes that seemed to have seen too much of human pain, received them in her Manhattan office with a warmth that immediately disarmed Emma. With Alexander, it was more difficult. I don't believe in this, he declared in the first session, arms crossed like a rebellious teenager. You don't need to believe in anything, Dr. Chen responded calmly. You just need to be willing to try. The sessions were painful. Alexander had to unearth memories he'd buried so deeply, he'd almost forgotten them. The day his mother left, the last look she gave him before closing the door, the subsequent years watching his father slowly consume himself. He talked about the first time he promised himself he'd never let anyone have that power over him, and how he'd kept that promise for 3 decades. Emma was present at some sessions, absent at others. When she was there, she learned things about her husband she never would have imagined, that he collected stones from different beaches as a child, each one a memory of a family trip that would never return, that he'd wanted to be a sailor before inheriting his father's empire, that he sometimes dreamed of his mother and woke with tears in his eyes he didn't know how to explain. Fear of abandonment, Dr. Chen explained in a joint session, manifests in many forms, sometimes as emotional distance, sometimes as obsessive control, sometimes as irrational jealousy, and sometimes as all of the above, Alexander murmured. The first step to overcoming it is recognizing it. The second is allowing yourself to be vulnerable despite the fear. Alexander looked at Emma, and she saw in his eyes something she'd never seen before, hope tinged with terror. What if I can't? Then we'll keep trying until you can, Dr. Chen responded. There are no shortcuts in this process. Outside of therapy, the changes were slow but perceptible. Alexander began to express his fears out loud instead of burying them. When jealousy assaulted him, because it still did, especially if someone looked at Emma a second too long, he named them instead of acting on them. I'm feeling jealous right now, he'd say, and the words sounded strange in his mouth, but each time he pronounced them, they lost a bit of their power. Emma learned not to minimize his feelings, not to say don't be ridiculous when he expressed fears that seemed irrational to her. Instead, she listened to him, validated him, and then gently reminded him of reality. that she was there, that she'd chosen him, that she had no intention of leaving. One April day, while they walked through the mansion's gardens, Alexander stopped in front of a rose bush that had just bloomed. "Do you know why I planted this rose bush?" he asked. Emma shook her head. "It was my mother's favorite. I planted it the year after she left, thinking if it grew, it meant she'd come back." "And did it grow?" "It grew, but she never came back." He plucked a rose and held it between his fingers. "For years, I hated it. Every time it bloomed, it was a reminder that hopes are for fools. And now," Alexander offered her the rose with a smile that transformed his face, "now I think roses bloom regardless of who's watching. And that maybe that's what we should do too." Emma took the flower, feeling tears accumulate in her eyes. "That's the most beautiful thing you've ever said to me." "Doctor Chen says I should practice emotional expression." He shrugged, but there was a lightness in his gesture that was new. "I guess I'm improving." "You're improving a lot." That night, they made love for the first time in weeks. It was different from all the previous times, slower, more conscious, as if each caress were a word in a language they'd just learned to speak. Afterward, lying in the darkness, Alexander spoke with a voice that was barely a whisper. "I think I love you more than I've ever loved anyone, and that still terrifies me." "Why are you telling me like that, giving me the fear along with the love?" "Because Dr. Chen says vulnerability includes sharing fears, not just pretty feelings." Emma snuggled against him, feeling his heart beat beneath her ear. "Then we'll keep facing them together, the pretty feelings and the fears." "Together," he repeated, and the word sounded like a promise. Summer arrived in the Hamptons with its usual explosion of heat and color. The mansion's wisteria was in full bloom, purple cascades falling down the white walls like frozen fireworks. The ocean gleamed like liquid sapphire under the relentless sun, and the air smelled of salt, jasmine, and possibilities. Emma woke one June morning with a strange feeling in her stomach. At first, she attributed it to the seafood they'd had for dinner the night before, but when the nausea persisted for the following days, she began to suspect something different. The pregnancy test trembled in her hands as she waited for the results in the white marble bathroom. 2 minutes that seemed like an eternity, and then the lines appeared, clear and undeniable. Positive. Emma sat on the edge of the bathtub, processing what that meant. She'd been married almost a year. She'd survived a disastrous honeymoon, months of loneliness, Alexander's jealousy, Daniel, Catherine, couples therapy, and more tears than she could count. And now inside her, a life was growing that was tangible proof of everything they'd built. She found Alexander in his office, reviewing documents with that concentration that once excluded her, but now no longer bothered her because she knew that when he looked up, his eyes would light up at seeing her. "I need to tell you something," she announced from the doorway. He immediately put down the papers, all his attention focused on her. "Is something wrong? You look pale." "I'm pregnant." The words fell between them like stones in a still pond, creating ripples that expanded in all directions. Alexander said nothing for a moment that seemed eternal. His face was a mask Emma couldn't read, and terror began to climb up her throat. What if he didn't want this? What if it was too soon? What if... Then he fell to his knees, literally fell to his knees in front of her, his hands seeking hers, his face transforming into something she'd never seen. Absolute vulnerability, mixed with a joy so intense it seemed painful. "Are you sure?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I just took the test, but yes, I'm sure. We're going to be parents. We're going to be parents." Tears began to fall down Alexander's cheeks, silent and abundant, and Emma felt hers match them. "I'm so scared," he confessed. "I'm scared of being like my father. I'm scared of repeating the same mistakes. I'm scared of—" "I know," she interrupted him softly, kneeling to be at his level. "But you also have Dr. Chen, and you have me, and you have everything you've learned this past year. You're not going to be like your father, Alexander. You're going to be better." "How can you be so sure?" "Because your father never asked for help, never admitted he had a problem, never allowed himself to change. You've done all that and more." Alexander hugged her with a force that left her breathless, his lips finding hers in a kiss that tasted of salt and promises. "I'm going to dedicate every day of my life to making sure this baby knows they're loved," he swore, "and that you know you're loved. Never again will I let my fears prevent me from showing you." The following months were a transformation. Alexander cancelled trips, delegated responsibilities, was present at every medical appointment, every ultrasound, every moment of morning sickness and nighttime cravings. He read books about fatherhood with the same dedication he once reserved for financial reports, and Emma frequently found him talking to her growing belly, telling stories about the stars and promising that he'd never, ever leave them alone. Catherine came to visit them in August, and the meeting was surprisingly emotional. The matriarch held Emma's hands over her 6-month belly and said, "This child is going to grow up surrounded by all the love we didn't know how to give. Thank you for not giving up on my son." "Thank you for helping me understand him," Emma responded. And for the first time, grandmother and daughter-in-law embraced without reservations. Daniel sent a congratulations note when the news became public. Alexander read it first, visibly tensing, but then left it on the table with a sigh. "I suppose I have to admit he's a good guy," he said reluctantly. "Is that a compliment?" "It's as close as I'm going to get." Emma smiled, remembering how far they'd come since that stormy night in Boston. "I think that's enough." Fall brought the final preparations. A room in the mansion was transformed into a nest of soft peach and white tones, with a carved wooden crib that Alexander had found at an antiques auction and personally restored. Emma watched him work, sanding and varnishing with a dedication that moved her to tears. "I'd never made anything with my own hands," he confessed one night while applying the last coat of varnish. "I always hired others to do the physical things." "And how does it feel?" "It feels real, like I'm creating something that truly matters." "You are, Alexander. You're creating a home." He looked at her with those eyes that had gone from being walls to being windows, and smiled. "No, my love, we're creating a home, together." Winter arrived with gentle rains that made the Atlantic look like liquid silver. Emma, 8 months pregnant, moved through the mansion like a majestic galleon, according to Rosa's words, and complained that there was no comfortable position to sleep, according to her own. Alexander had become adorably overprotective. He insisted on accompanying her everywhere, brought her pillows without asking, personally prepared the teas the doctor had recommended. Sometimes Emma had to remind him she was pregnant, not sick, but deep down, his attention made her feel more loved than any jewel or gift he could give her. One December night, while they watched the Christmas lights they'd placed in the garden, Alexander broke a comfortable silence with an unexpected question. "Did you ever imagine your life would be like this?" Emma considered the question carefully. "If you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have told you I'd never marry someone I didn't love, that I'd never sacrifice my dreams for money or security. And now? Now I understand that love doesn't always come packaged as we expect. Sometimes it comes disguised as obligation and reveals its true nature only when we're willing to see it." Alexander intertwined his fingers with hers. "I was an idiot for so long. All that time we lost." "It wasn't lost. It was needed." Emma squeezed his hand. "If we'd gotten to this point too quickly, maybe we wouldn't have appreciated what we have." "You think so? I think every difficult moment prepared us for the good ones, and that the good moments to come will be even better because we know what it cost to build them." Alexander kissed her softly, his hand resting on the belly where their child moved with the impatience characteristic of the haze. "I love you," he said, and the words no longer sounded like a confession ripped out by force, but like a truth as natural as breathing. "I love you more than I knew it was possible to love. And I love you, despite everything. Or maybe because of everything." That night, while the rain softly beat against the windows, they talked for hours about the future, about the names they'd chosen. Sophia, if it was a girl, in honor of Emma's maternal grandmother. James, if it was a boy, for reasons Alexander still hadn't confessed. "Why James?" she finally asked. Alexander took time to respond, as if gathering courage. "It was my father's name," he finally said. "Thomas was his middle name, the one he used professionally." But at home, my mother called him James. I didn't know. There are many things about him I never knew until recently. My mother has been sharing memories she kept for years. Some are painful, others make me wish I'd known him better before he died. Maybe it's good you're getting to know him now. Maybe it's what you needed to be ready to be a father yourself. Alexander nodded, and she saw how a solitary tear slid down his cheek without making any effort to hide it. Dr. Chen says grief doesn't have expiration dates, that we can mourn losses that occurred decades ago as if they were recent. Dr. Chen is wise. She is. He smiled through the tears. But you're even wiser. Emma snuggled against him, feeling how their baby kicked rhythmically, as if wanting to participate in the conversation. I'm just someone who learned not to give up, she said, even when everything seemed lost. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for making it worthwhile. And as the rain continued to fall and the Christmas lights glowed like captured stars, both knew they'd reached a place few have the fortune to find, the peace that comes after the storm, the certainty born from having gone through fire together. Christmas Day dawned with a clear sky and a golden light that seemed to bless the earth. Hayes Manor was decorated like never before, with natural pine garlands perfuming every corner and a 15-foot tree that Alexander had insisted on decorating personally, though Emma had to direct the operation from the sofa due to her advanced state. Guests began arriving shortly after noon. Emma's parents, Robert and Margaret, had traveled from Napa with several bottles of the winery's best wine, including a special reserve they'd saved for the first grandchild's birth. Rosa had prepared a feast worthy of kings, with Iberian ham, fresh Atlantic seafood, and a roast that melted at the touch. Catherine arrived last, in a dark green velvet dress and lips painted the same crimson she wore in her best days. She brought something wrapped in antique tissue paper. For the baby, she said, offering it to Emma. It was Alexander's when he was born. I kept it for 36 years, waiting for the right moment. Inside was a small christening outfit of white lace, delicate as a spiderweb, perfectly preserved. Emma felt tears accumulate as she caressed the fabric. It's beautiful. My mother embroidered it by hand, Catherine said, and for the first time, her voice sounded genuinely emotional. Alexander was christened in it, and now his child will be too. Alexander observed the exchange from across the room, his eyes shining with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He crossed the room and hugged his mother, something Emma had never seen him do. Thank you, Mom, he whispered, for everything. Catherine held him against her, and for a fleeting moment, they were simply a mother and son reconnecting after years of distance. Dinner was magical. Candles glowed on the table, conversations flowed effortlessly, and for the first time in that house's history, there was genuine laughter filling every corner. Robert told stories of Emma's childhood that made her blush. Margaret shared family recipes with Rosa as if they were old friends, and Catherine surprised everyone with a singing voice she hadn't used in decades, intoning carols that made Alexander cry without any shame. It was near 11 at night when Emma felt the first pain. At first, she dismissed it as another of the many discomforts of advanced pregnancy, but when the second pain came 15 minutes later, and the third 10 minutes after that, she knew it wasn't coincidence. Alexander, she said softly, trying not to alarm the others. I think it's time. He looked at her without understanding for a second. Then realization hit his face like a wave. Now. The baby's coming now. Seems like they decided they wanted to be a Christmas present. What followed was organized chaos. Alexander forgot where he'd put the car keys. Robert found them in his pocket. Margaret packed a bag with things that had already been packed for weeks. And Catherine took control with a calm that surprised everyone, organizing logistics as if she'd been born for it. Lenox Hill Hospital in Manhattan was prepared. Dr. Martinez, who had followed the pregnancy from the beginning, received them with a reassuring smile. Looks like we'll have a Christmas baby, she said. They're the best. The following hours were a whirlwind of pain, hope, and transformation. Alexander held Emma's hand during every contraction, whispering words of encouragement that came from some deep place in his being that even he didn't know existed. "You're the strongest woman I know," he told her. "You're incredible. I love you. I'm here with you." And when, at 3:47 in the morning of December 26th, a baby's cry filled the delivery room, Alexander Hayes fell to his knees for the second time in his life. "It's a girl," the doctor announced, placing the tiny being on Emma's chest. "Perfect." Sophia came into the world with eyes wide open, as if she wanted to see everything immediately. She had her father's dark hair and eyes of a golden brown that promised to become like her mother's. She was small, perfect, and absolutely real. Alexander touched his daughter's cheek with a trembling finger, and tears fell onto the blanket wrapping her. "Hello, Sophia," he whispered. "I'm your dad, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life protecting you, loving you, and making sure you never have to doubt your worth." Emma watched her husband's face, transformed by a tenderness that would have been unthinkable barely a year ago, and knew everything had been worth it. Every tear, every fight, every moment of doubt and desperation had been a step toward this perfect instant. "We did it," she said, her voice hoarse from effort but full of joy. Alexander kissed her softly, with Sophia between them, like a living bridge between past and future. "You did it," he responded. "I just had the fortune to learn to deserve you." And as the December sun began to peek through the hospital windows, bathing the new family in golden light, Emma knew they'd reached the end of one journey and the beginning of another. A journey that had started with jealousy and ended with love. A journey that had proven even the most closed hearts can learn to open. A journey that had finally taught them that true love isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to love despite it. And as 1 year later, the December sun fell obliquely over Harrison Estate Winery's vineyards, tinting the dormant vines with ancient gold. The cold air of Napa winter smelled of wet earth, and the bonfires workers lit to warm their hands during winter pruning. Emma walked among the rows of vines with Sophia in her arms, pointing to the vines with the same excitement with which her father had shown them to her more than 2 decades ago. "Look, sweetheart," she said, though Sophia was more interested in grabbing strands of her mother's hair. "These are the Cabernet grapes that give us the richest wine in the world." Alexander followed them a few steps behind, his elegant Italian shoes stained with mud, his cashmere coat splattered with dry leaves, and a smile on his face that would have been impossible to imagine 2 years ago. "Did you know," he said, catching up with them, "that this vineyard produces exactly 857 gallons of wine per year?" Emma turned to look at him with raised eyebrows. "Have you been studying?" "Your father gave me an intensive course this morning. I think I've finally passed his standards. High honor. The highest." They continued walking until they reached the top of a small hill from where the entire valley could be seen. In the distance, the town of Yountville was silhouetted against the mountains, its rooftops shining under the winter sun. Closer, Emma's parents' house, now renovated thanks to Alexander's investment, exhaled the fragrant smoke from the fireplace. Alexander stopped and breathed deeply. "I think I understand now," he said, "why you loved this place so much. What do you understand? Why you cried silently those first nights in the Hamptons? Why you seemed lost in a house that had everything except meaning?" He looked at her with shining eyes. "This place has soul, and I was so busy building soulless empires that I didn't know how to recognize the difference." Emma handed him Sophia, who immediately began pulling on his tie. "And now, do you know how to recognize it? Now I know the most valuable things can't be bought, that love isn't a weakness, but the greatest strength, and that the jealousy that almost destroyed me ended up being what saved me. It saved you. It forced me to really look at you, to face what I felt, to admit I was more afraid of losing you than of dropping my defenses." He kissed his daughter's forehead. "The jealousy was the trigger, but you were the salvation." They walked back toward the house, where Margaret was already preparing the Christmas roast, and Robert was tuning his guitar for the evening's carols. Catherine had arrived that morning, carrying gifts for her granddaughter, and a genuine smile that still surprised Emma every time she saw it. Dinner was a glorious chaos of laughter, music, and abundant wine. Sophia passed from arm to arm, adored by everyone, looking at the world with those golden eyes that saw everything, and judged nothing. Alexander helped Robert carve the lamb. Rosa brought her famous king cake from the Hamptons, and when the guitar began to play, even Catherine joined in the singing, with a voice that seemed to have freed itself from decades of silence. Near midnight, when the elders were starting to nod off and the dishes were being cleared, Alexander took Emma's hand and guided her outside, toward the small vineyard they'd planted together that spring. The vines were bare now, waiting for next season's awakening, but there was something hopeful in their stillness. "I wanted to give you something," Alexander said, taking a small box from his pocket. "Another gift. You already gave me the necklace this morning. This one is different." Inside the box was an antique gold ring with a small ruby set in the center. It was beautiful, but clearly not new. "It was my grandmother Eleanor's," he explained. "The original one, not my mother. Her mother gave it to her on her wedding day, and she gave it to her daughter, and so on for 5 generations. Your mother gave it to you." "This morning, she said it was time for it to be part of a family that knew how to love again." Tears came to Emma's eyes as he slid the ring onto her finger, next to her wedding band. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything, just stay." Alexander pulled her toward him, his arms wrapping around her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "Stay with me forever. Keep teaching me to be better than I think I can be. Keep loving me despite all my flaws." "You don't have as many flaws as you think. I have more than you imagine, but every day with you there's one less." Emma looked up at the sky, where the stars shone with the clarity only the countryside can offer. She thought about the path they'd traveled, from that suite in Santa Barbara, where she'd cried alone, to this vineyard, where she was surrounded by more love than she'd ever dreamed. "You know what I learned?" she said. "I learned that love isn't finding someone perfect. It's finding someone imperfect and deciding every day that their imperfections are worth it." "And are mine worth it?" Emma kissed him, soft and deep, with all the love that had grown between them, like the vines surrounding them, slowly, with work, and producing something extraordinary. Every single one of them. They stayed there a moment longer, embraced under the stars, listening to the music and laughter coming from the house. In the distance, Sophia cried briefly and then quieted, probably lulled by the songs her grandmother Margaret sang to her, and Emma thought that life was strange and wonderful in equal parts, that sometimes love comes disguised as obligation, and jealousy is just love that doesn't yet know its name, that families are built with more than blood, and that broken hearts can heal if they find the right hands to hold them. Alexander had been her greatest challenge and her greatest reward, and she, without knowing it, had been his salvation. As they returned to the house hand in hand, with the cold biting their cheeks but warmth filling their chests, Emma knew with absolute certainty that she'd found her home. Not in a glass mansion in the Hamptons, not in the vineyards of Napa, but in the arms of the man walking beside her, imperfect and beautiful, scared and brave, cold on the outside, but burning inside with a love that had taken too long to recognize but now shone brighter than any star. And that, she thought as they crossed the threshold into warmth and light, was exactly how it should be. Because the best love stories aren't the ones that start with a kiss in the rain. They're the ones that start with impossible obstacles and end with the certainty that every tear, every fight, every moment of doubt was worth it. They're the stories that prove true. Love isn't a destination, but a journey. A journey that for Emma and Alexander was just beginning.